China is celebrating after Donald Trump met Putin in Alaska, then the Europeans and Zelensky in Washington. And today Newsweek comes out with the thesis that the failure of the Trump-Putin summit is a gift to China. And here's the direct wording from their article. China is the main beneficiary of this story. Ukrainian media immediately picked up on this and conveyed the idea in simple terms. No agreement was reached, the conflict continues, the West is completely stuck in this war, and Europe is taking on all the burden in some still mythical future security guarantees. That's exactly what works for Beijing. It's convenient for Beijing if the war continues. Let's break down exactly what pleased China about Donald Trump's attempts to negotiate something. Which statements can we trust now, so we're relying on facts instead of conspiracy theories? So let's analyze why it's absolutely beneficial for China for any peace negotiations about Ukraine to ultimately fail. My name is Alexei Pichi. Today is August 20th according to the calendar. And before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, leave a like, write any comments you want, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pichi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. There, we post breaking news as soon as it comes in. So the summit in Anchorage, as you know, ended without a deal. This is the official statement, not only of the Western press, but also of Chinese state media. The Xinhua agency today directly writes that the meeting did not bring any deal. And in this context, you can immediately hear the second point. Beijing publicly supports the very fact of dialogue between Washington and Moscow. They speak carefully, but the line is clear. Dialogue is good, escalation is bad. It would seem, well, what's wrong with this statement from China? Translated into geopolitics? The longer the sides argue, the longer negotiations drag on without results, the more room China has to maneuver in Asia and in resource markets. The Chinese party press emphasized its points without any hesitation, and the newspaper Global Times published an editorial column with a headline that literally reads, I would say, dialogue and negotiations are the inevitable path. In the same article, experts emphasize the symbolism of the meeting and the atmosphere of equality. The underlying message for the Chinese domestic reader is this. The United States may exert pressure, but they will still have to return to talks. This means that China's model, patience, negotiation, and playing the long game, pays off. And furthermore, the article notes this will likely drag on for a long time. That's why it would be better for Americans to adopt our model. Just patience, have patience and observe. In another article from the same Global Times, the spokesperson of the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mao Ning, is quoted as saying that China will promote peace in its own way. And very evasively, then she answers the question of whether Beijing is ready to be a guarantor for Ukraine. Here she says, this is a classic Chinese yes, but actually no. She says, we will support the method of security guarantees for Ukraine, but we will not take the main responsibility for it. Why? Because they're also using Trump's phrase, this is not their war. The American side, strangely enough, gave China a bonus and an economic one at that. As a result of these negotiations, United States Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stated that the current situation with China is working quite well. You see, their trade negotiations failed, and Trump extended the pause on mutual tariffs for another 90 days. And for Bessent, the situation with China is actually quite good. So the tariff pause has been extended for another 90 days. The talks are ongoing. There won't be any big sledgehammers, as Scott Bessent himself said. No sledgehammers will be used against the Chinese economy, but according to Bessent, everything is going quite well. And while in Europe, everyone is asking how to build guarantees for Ukraine, and in Washington, how not to crash the economy before the elections, Beijing understands that it can continue to play the game of forced interdependence. That doesn't mean the United States has given up. But this pauses oxygen for Chinese industry, including the part that fuels the Russian military economy through the sale of dual-use goods. Here is the official Chinese industry. The Chinese press is promoting a new message. The shadow of peace is better than the fog of war. This is the exact headline in China Daily. The logic is clear. If you can't do it quickly and harshly in Europe, do it slowly and flexibly. That's the formula that benefits Beijing. Lukewarm. The current Western-Russian bargaining keeps the United States and the European Union tied to Ukraine. Meanwhile, China is doing its own thing, expanding its influence in Asia, boosting exports, strengthening logistics, and eyeing Taiwan. That's what China Daily writes. Moreover, observers in the West are also openly talking about China's interests without any diplomatic pretense. And the aforementioned Newsweek repeatedly emphasizes that it is China that stands to gain the most. If the United States and Russia get stuck in a let's agree later arrangement, or as I call it, an agreed to agree situation, China only benefits from this. This leads to a rather alarming conclusion. If Putin's aggression, if Russia's aggression in Europe pays off, if he gets what he wanted, it has a huge impact on the deterrence format in Asia. This is a direct link between Ukraine and Taiwan, which Beijing recognizes even if it claims it's only about principles. That is, China understands perfectly well, if Russia gets some Ukrainian territories now, the sanctions will be lifted and Ukraine won't get any reparations or compensation. Then why not try to seize Taiwan? There are no consequences for the aggressor. And let's be honest about the military economy. For the past 2 years, China has been Russia's main source of oxygen for its dual-use industry. That's electronics, machinery, components, tires, chemicals, and so on and so on and so on. These items could serve peaceful uses, but we know they're being used for military purposes in the direction of Radio Svoboda, by the way, carefully reminds us that Wang Yi openly told Europeans that Beijing cannot accept Russia's defeat. This doesn't mean that China is for the war. It means that China is for a Russia that doesn't lose, because a loss would mean chaos and an American foothold on China's border. Against the backdrop of the failed summit in Alaska, as many believe, this stance is not weakening. On the contrary, it is getting stronger. The United States did not give any sanction carte blanche against China. On the contrary, the status quo remains. And Scott Besson says, yes, everything is fine. We have introduced another 90-day pause on tariffs. It's not like Trump threatened to impose any tariffs because China is buying Russian oil. No, he even continued the pause on the tariffs that were already on hold. Beijing is kind of making a note for itself that, okay, we can keep doing exactly the same thing, dragging things out, playing games, and so on. Why not? It works. It works. How does China view potential security guarantees for Ukraine? There are nuanced dynamics at play. Asked if China will be a guarantor, the foreign ministry says, we will promote peace our own way. That's not a yes, it's more neutral, like we're special and we'll handle this our own way. For Beijing, being a formal guarantor adds responsibility and risks straining relations with either Moscow or Europe. It's much more convenient to be the grown-up in the room, always in favor of dialogue, but never signing anything or taking responsibility for anything. Right now, in Global Times, Xinhua, and other Chinese media, the prevailing idea is that what's needed is productive dialogue, not tough conditions. How does this align with American policy in recent days? Trump claims he's showing toughness, stating that if Putin rejects peace, Russia, China, India, and Brazil will all face consequences. There are actually no heavy tariffs on China, as the tariff truce has been extended. Regarding Ukraine, the narrative is being pushed that there won't be American troops in Ukraine, but Ukraine must give up some territories. Here, Beijing gains another edge. Any arrangement where the United States handles coordination and air support, while Europe is responsible for everything on the ground and the funding, means that part of the American logistics will be focused specifically in Europe. And Asia, meanwhile, is in a different position. So, basically, the forces that could have been used to contain China will remain in Europe. And let me add here, so you don't think that it's only Chinese media presenting information in this way. Reuters gathered the reactions of leaders after the Alaska meeting and presented exactly the same perspective. The deal didn't happen. The Europeans are tense and Moscow has taken a stance. Maybe, but then Washington says that we will continue, but without specifics, like today, at the table. And this fits perfectly into the Chinese worldview. Western democracies will argue about procedure for a very long time, while China will be bargaining for its own benefit during that time. And now, why does this directly concern Ukraine? If we put it in simple terms, the Chinese enthusiasm after the Alaska meeting between Putin and Trump means at least three things. The longer there is no deal, the longer the Russian economy survives, thanks to Chinese companies and parallel imports through Asian markets. Second, the more cautious the United States is with tariffs and sectoral strikes against China, the fewer levers and less political will there is to pressure China's supply channels to Russia. And that means it's harder to strangle the Russian military-industrial complex. The louder the talk about a deal, the more Beijing's argument counterspins, saying that if it's possible in Europe, then it's also possible to agree on spheres of influence in Asia. Maybe Taiwan could be given to China since it's in China's sphere of influence. Now, the conclusion: Chinese media are currently working with their audience roughly according to the following template: dialogue is good. There was no deal on Ukraine in Alaska. That's not a tragedy either. The key is that everyone realized the need to talk. Direct dialogue with the Russian aggressors is essential. In Chinese logic, to talk means to stretch out time, raise the price, and watch to see whose nerves will give out, and whose nerves will give out first. And here, forgive me for being blunt, our task is simply not to give any reason. Negotiations, okay, but without these phrases about spheres of influence, without veto rights for the aggressor, and without exchanging territories, then the Chinese enthusiasm dies down, and the European-American alliance stops seeming, excuse me, slow-witted. It turns out it can work. It can actually work. If that happens, then China will have problems. Currently, China has no issues and has seen that negotiations can last for weeks. Using Putin as an example, you can easily deceive Trump, and he'll just say, well, we're negotiating, aren't we? But what sanctions, what tariffs, what pressure? As long as negotiations are ongoing, there's no need for any of that. But according to the Chinese model, these negotiations can go on forever. While talks with Putin continue, let me remind you once again, the United States, they extended the pause on imposing mutual tariffs for another 90 days, and China feels quite safe. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.